In English, many social sciences and humanities disciplines now make use of an impersonal, nominalised discourse in order to sound scientific and obviously to acquire some of the prestige that presently accrues to the sciences. For example, this abstract in the field of dance therapy is largely indistinguishable from the hard sciences in the kind of discourse that it uses. You can see the nominalizations all in red and the impersonal verb forms underlined. Likewise, this extract from cultural studies. However, some humanities disciplines prefer a more clausal, less nominalised style, but they will still make the effort to be clear and economical and impersonal, and to use short, simple sentences and straightforward vocabulary, as in this example from the historian Christopher Hill. Now, this is very different from the kind of discourse that is predominant in the Portuguese humanities, which is characterised by a series of features that have no equivalents in English. As these will typically intrude into the second language writing of Portuguese scholars, it's worth looking at them in more detail. Now, here are some of the characteristics of Portuguese humanistic discourse, as I discovered from my 2008 corpus. First of all, the sentences tend to be much longer and with a lot of subordination. In my corpus, the longest sentence is 358 words, and there are many stretches of text in which all the sentences are over 70 words. Secondly, deferred topics. Rather than a frontal statement of theme that is preferred in English, the main topic of a Portuguese text is often deferred, creating an element of suspense. Interpersonal framing devices. Claims are rarely presented directly as in English, but are usually introduced by a framing device that highlights the interpersonal relationship between the author and the reader of the text. Verbless sentences. It is frequent to find these in Portuguese humanities texts, but they're strictly prohibited in English. Historical tenses. Historical texts typically make use of present and future verb forms in order to refer to events in the completed past. There is no equivalent to this in English, except perhaps in informal oral registers. Personal references. Now, many Portuguese humanities texts are much less impersonal than their equivalents would be in English. And they habitually make use of personal pronoun forms in a way that would be frowned upon in English. Gerunds. Now, this is a verb form that is very common in Portuguese, but is used sparingly in English because it is rather imprecise. And finally, poetic or figurative or high-flown diction, which is something that is very difficult to transpose convincingly into English. Let's have a look at some of these in a little bit more detail. First of all, the complex sentences. Now, the example that you have here from a Portuguese history text is a long sentence. It has 106 words. But more important than its length is its structure. In fact, this would be completely impossible to reproduce literally in English because, first, of the dense subordination. I've tried to highlight some of the various syntactical relations using colours. The embedding of the main information within an interpersonal structure, and that is underlined. And also because of the constant interruption of the main clauses by circumstantial information. Now, in English, this would need to be completely reformulated by splitting the long sentence into short ones, pruning away the subordination, and perhaps by replacing the magisterial we in the first sentence with an impersonal structure. Or we could even assimilate it even more to English, as in this translation. which has removed the interpersonal framework completely in order to front the factual information, and by also making the logical connection between those facts more explicit than they were in the original. Let's move on to deferred topics. Now, these can occur on all ranks of the text. This example is an abstract where the main point is deferred to the end of the whole text. In English, the information would need to be reorganised in order to put the main theme at the beginning. This deferral can also occur on the level of the sentence with a cohesive device known as cataphora or forward referencing. Once again, English prefers to state the information explicitly first and then to refer back to it. And then on the level of the clause, we do often find inversions of the normal word order in Portuguese used for rhetorical effect. But the grammar of English does not permit a literal rendering of such structures, and so they have to effectively be neutralised. The interpersonal framing devices. Well, claims in these Portuguese humanities texts are rarely made directly, but tend to be embedded within interpersonal structures that focus on some aspect of the author-reader relationship. And these have various functions. Some of them have equivalents in English, but others don't. The problem is they add a lot of words to the sentence, which contravenes the demand for economy. English would tend to prefer to find more concise ways of saying the same thing. The first example, which is used for emphasis, does have an equivalent in English. We can simply say something like, it should be pointed out, or it should be emphasised that. It's essentially the same. In the second one, which is expressing attitude, it would probably be more natural in English to use an adverbial, something like surprisingly, interestingly, understandably. In this third example, which expresses degree of certainty, or the technical term being epistemic modality, we have the possibility of using either an adverb, something like possibly, certainly, probably, or to replace it with a verbal form, a modal auxiliary, may, might, could, will. And all of these are shorter forms than the equivalent in Portuguese. The fourth category, however, seems to have almost no semantic content at all. And I would strongly advise these to be omitted because they tend to be empty words which simply pad out the sentence in English. The fourth characteristic that I identified at the beginning was the verbless sentence, which is anathema in English. We must have grammatically complete sentences, else the text will be viewed as badly written. But both my corpora of Portuguese academic texts, both the 2008 one and the more recent 2013 one, contain many, many examples of verbless sentences. So I am assuming that this is a vestige of a rhetorical orientation to text production that incorporated many oral aspects into written discourse. A great many of these tend to be relative clauses which have become detached from their main clause, while others seem to be designed to create a particular effect. However, in English these cannot be reproduced like this. We do need to insert a finite verb. Historical tenses. Now, this is a feature that is shared by all the Romance languages. It involves speaking of the historical past using present and future tenses, presumably to create immediacy. In English, something similar happens in popular genres, such as in oral narratives or even in television documentaries, but it is not considered appropriate for formal academic style. Therefore, the tenses need to be converted. The norm in English would be to use what we call the narrative tenses. That's the past simple, the past continuous, and the past perfect when referring to past events, historical events. Personal references. Now, Portuguese humanistic writing shows a clear preference for active over passive structures, in keeping with its emphasis on human subjectivity. And the use of personal pronouns probably derives directly from this. Some of them have correspondences in English, such as the inclusive we to refer to author and reader, or to refer to the discourse community as a whole. But others do not. For example, there is the magisterial we for authorial self-reference. Now this sounds incredibly pompous and self-important in English when it's used by a single author. It would be more common in English to use some kind of an impersonal verb form, or, when referring to subjective judgments, the first person singular to refer to a single author, I. Now in this example, we, the first person plural, is being used to refer to the Portuguese nation as a whole. I would suggest that this reveals a rather narrow frame of reference on the part of the author, which would not be appropriate when the text is addressing a broader international public. Therefore, it would seem more appropriate in English to replace this first person form with reference to Portugal. For example, in Portugal instead of entre nós. The third example uses we to refer to all the people alive today. Now this one also has no equivalent in English. I think we'd probably be more likely to use something like today or nowadays. And in this particular case, it would probably be sufficient to say simply, his will has not survived, and to leave the rest elliptical. Gerunds. Now the verbal structure that the Portuguese call gerúndio, which more properly is the present participle in English, is very common in humanistic writing in Portuguese, but it is rather vague and can sometimes be ambiguous, as it is used for many different kinds of logical relations. This would usually need to be replaced in English by a more precise structure. Here, for example, it is used for manner. Here, for time. This one is a causal relation. Contrast. Addition, or maybe contrast again, it's not clear. And condition. And finally, the last characteristic is the tendency for high-flown or poetic diction. Now here are just some of the examples that I found in my corpus. Now all of these actually seem inappropriately emotive in a scholarly text in English, and so I would strongly avoid authors to avoid this kind of thing when writing in English, and to try to remain a little more dispassionate. So, in short then, Portuguese humanistic writing is trying to do something completely different from English academic discourse. Clarity, economy and precision are clearly not its main objectives at all. In fact, it seems to be more akin to literary writing than to technical or scientific discourse. And I would also suggest that it reflects a phenomenological rather than an empiricist orientation to knowledge, in which knowledge of the outside world is understood to be mediated by human perception and symbolic systems. As such, it cannot be translated into English without completely destroying the epistemological infrastructure of the text. My advice to authors in the humanities that want to write in English is, do not try to translate your Portuguese text. You'll just get tied up in knots. Basically, you have to unlearn everything you were taught in Portuguese about what counts as good writing and approach the English academic text in a completely different way, always bearing in mind the three cardinal virtues of clarity, economy, and precision. Whether or not you feel it's worth making the effort will depend entirely upon your own personal motives for wanting to write English academic discourse.